February 1945. Cold seeps through broken window panes, carrying the distant thud of artillery that no longer decides anything for the men inside. On iron cots lined in two long rows lie the remnants of a once proud army. Field gray uniforms hang in tatters, blankets cover what is no longer there, a sleeve pinned flat to a tunic, a trouser leg folded and stitched where a knee should be. The raw smell of antiseptic battles the heavier scent of sweat, blood, and fear. They are German prisoners of war recently pulled from the snow and mud of a collapsing front. The war is clearly lost. For these men, half-limbed and barely alive, the question is not who wins but how they will die. Rumors run through the ward in hushed, clenched whispers. The Americans will not waste food on cripples. The useless will be taken outside, finished quickly. No more bandages, no more pain. Boots approach down the corridor. But when the door opens, it is not a firing squad that enters. It is American doctors, carrying plaster bandages, measuring tapes, and the first sketches of new limbs. By 1943, the war Germany had unleashed was turning back upon it with a force no one in Berlin could control. On the steppe outside Stalingrad, an entire army had vanished. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps had been driven into the sea. In the skis over the Reich, American B-17s and British Lancasters carved fiery corridors through industrial cities that had once fed the Wehrmacht's advance. Every gain of the early years had been paid for in blood. Now the bill was coming due. Casualty lists lengthened into columns, then into pages. By 1944, German losses on the Eastern Front alone numbered in the millions. On the Western Front, against the British and Americans, the figures climbed relentlessly. For every man killed, others returned broken in ways that would not heal. They arrived first at field dressing stations, dragged or carried from shell-pocked fields. Medics worked in shallow dugouts or shattered barns, cutting uniforms away, clamping arteries, trying to decide who could be saved and who could only be made comfortable. Tourniquets were tightened around thighs and upper arms. Morphine syringes slipped under stained collars. Next came the casualty clearing posts and field hospitals. Under canvas roofs or in requisition schools, surgeons worked in shifts that never ended. They amputated shattered legs, removed arms pulped by blast and shrapnel, and carved away tissue already darkening with gangrene. Instruments were boiled, then used again. Blood pooled under operating tables and froze in the winter air. When the wounded could survive travel, they were sent back by train to Germany. Hospital wagons rattled through the night, lit only by dim bulbs and cigarettes cupped in tired hands. On stretchers stacked three high laymen who would never again stand unaided. Limbs lost in Ukraine, in Sicily, in Normandy. Faces burned black in tank turrets. Eyes wrapped in gauze that would never be removed to see the front again. Inside the Reich, the system strained. There were military hospitals in every region, some in ancient spa towns, others hastily set up in schools and monasteries. Nurses and orderlies hustled between wards, changing dressings, feeding men who could not lift their own spoons. Crutches lined corridors, wheelchairs jammed stairwells. In therapy rooms, those who could tried to learn how to move with what they had left. The image of the war cripple was not new to Germany. After the First World War, veterans on crude wooden legs and with tin facial masks had become a familiar, haunting sight. But the Nazi regime had entered power with its own ideas about worth and strength. Before the war, under the Action T4 program, the state had secretly killed tens of thousands of disabled Germans judged unfit or a burden. Gas chambers disguised as showers, syringes in the night, starvation by design. Families received false death certificates. Weakness was treated as a stain that must be erased. Yet the same regime that murdered disabled civilians needed its soldiers. A man who lost an arm at the front was not a useless eater in official propaganda, but a hero, a front fighter who had sacrificed his body for the nation. Posters showed smiling amputees in uniform, framed by flags and medals. In reality, the line between valued veteran and expendable invalid was thin, and often depended on age, politics, and circumstance. Some badly wounded men were fitted with German-made prostheses, especially after 1941 when the number of amputees grew sharply. Workshops produced wooden legs, leather harnesses, simple metal hooks. Instructional films showed how a one-armed man could still work a lathe, or how a leg amputee could farm with the right support. But resources shrank as the war dragged on. Allied bombing gutted factories and transport links. Coal and steel were diverted to tanks and aircraft, not hospital fittings. Skilled craftsmen were drafted or killed. The hospitals filled faster than they could discharge patients. Prosthetics took time, material, and labor that a besieged Reich no longer had in abundance. By 1944, the lands once occupied by German troops had become killing grounds in reverse. In Normandy's hedgerows, in the forests of the Ardennes, in the ruins of Warsaw and Budapest, German units were ground down. Men fought with less equipment, less air cover, less hope. And as the fronts collapsed, more and more of the badly wounded did not find their way back to German hospitals at all. They were captured where they fell. Some were taken on the road to the rear, white bandages already seeping through with blood. Others lay for hours or days in shell holes or in basements of burning towns until Allied medics found them. In these moments under shell fire or in the smoke of a recent battle, distinctions between friend and enemy blurred into a simpler reality. A man bleeding out is a man in need of a tourniquet. But for the German soldiers, raised on years of propaganda about Anglo-American cruelty, and haunted by what they knew or suspected about their own regime's treatment of the weak, one question dominated the fog of pain. What would their captors do with them now? In the East, many had heard of mass deaths in Soviet captivity, of starvation, disease, and harsh reprisals. Rumors did the rest. On the Western Front, stories were different, but fear ran just as deep. Few expected kindness. Fewer still imagined a future where their missing limbs would be replaced at the expense of the enemy. By early 1945, trains and convoys no longer carried every broken German body back into the Reich. Instead, tens of thousands of wounded and disabled soldiers found themselves moved into American-run medical facilities and prisoner camps across France, Belgium, Italy, and later Germany itself. From that moment on, their survival, their treatment, and the possibility of a life beyond the war no longer depended on Berlin. It depended on the regulations, ethics, and decisions of the United States Army. Long before the first wounded German shuffled into an American ward, his fate had been outlined in ink. In 1929, diplomats in Geneva drafted a convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. It was not perfect. It could not prevent all cruelty or neglect. But on paper it was clear about certain things. Prisoners were to be housed, clothed, and fed in a manner comparable to the captor's own troops. They were to be protected from violence, reprisals, and public humiliation. The wounded and sick were to receive medical care equal to that of the soldiers who had captured them. The United States signed that convention. Its army lawyers digested the clauses. Its training manuals absorbed the language. When America entered the war in December 1941, those rules were already part of the doctrine taught to officers who would command camps and hospitals. The first real test came in North Africa. In 1942 and 1943, as American and British forces pushed Axis troops back across the desert, thousands of German and Italian soldiers fell into Allied hands. Many were captured in mass surrenders, tired, dusty, often hungry, but still on their feet. Others were pulled wounded from knocked-out tanks and shattered trenches, their bandages already stiff with dried blood. American medics treating their own men under fire now faced decisions that the Geneva Convention had anticipated in theory. A battlefield casualty station might receive 3 wounded Americans and 2 wounded Germans at the same time. Limited plasma, limited operating tables, a handful of surgeons. In principle, the law said nationality could not determine who bled to death and who did not. In practice, triage still relied on medical judgment, who could be saved, who was too far gone. But once an enemy soldier was on a stretcher in an American medical chain, the expectation from above was unambiguous: he was now a patient. As the war expanded, the United States built an entire architecture to handle prisoners. Across the American South, Midwest, and West, barbed wire compounds rose on former fairgrounds, farmlands, and military reservations. By 1945, hundreds of thousands of German POWs lived behind those fences. Others remained in camps and depots in the United Kingdom, Italy, France, and later in occupied Germany, but still under American control. Alongside these camps, the U.S. Army Medical Department organized a parallel system of care. General hospitals, station hospitals, and specialized annexes were designated to receive enemy wounded. Some were ordinary American facilities with segregated POW wards. Others functioned almost entirely as prisoner hospitals, their beds filled with men in field gray or Africa Corps tan instead of olive drab. Red Cross delegates visited and filed reports. War Department memoranda traveled back and forth between Washington and theater headquarters, clarifying points of law. Could POWs donate blood for other POWs? Yes. Could they be used in medical experiments? No. What about occupational therapy, prosthetic fitting, and rehabilitation? The Geneva Convention encouraged activities that preserved health and dignity, and American planners saw practical value in keeping prisoners fit for work. There were frictions. On the home front, not everyone understood or accepted that enemy soldiers were receiving decent food, shelter, and medical care while rationing and casualty telegrams reached American families. Newspaper articles, letters to editors, and congressional queries occasionally bristled at coddled Nazis behind U.S. barbed wire. Military authorities answered with three main arguments. First, law and honor required adherence to the Geneva Convention. Second, decent treatment of German POWs could encourage German forces to surrender rather than fight to the death, potentially saving American lives. Third, reciprocity mattered. If the United States wanted its own captured airmen and soldiers to be treated humanely, it had to demonstrate that standard itself. In the details of medical care, those principles became real. American surgeons did not stop at basic first aid for prisoners. Complex operations were performed on German POWs in U.S. hospitals: chest surgeries, bone reconstructions, neurosurgical procedures. The same blood substitutes, antibiotics as they became available, and surgical techniques used on American GIs were in many institutions also applied to their captives. For those whose limbs could not be saved, amputation followed. After the stump healed, another question emerged. Was it enough to prevent infection and leave the man alive but permanently helpless? Or did the obligation extend further into the realm of prosthetics and rehabilitation? From a purely legal standpoint, the Geneva Convention spoke of maintaining prisoners' health and fitness, facilitating their eventual repatriation, and in serious cases, considering their early return. It did not require captor nations to fit costly artificial limbs. But in the American system, the line was not drawn so narrowly. Partly because the United States was already engaged in extensive prosthetic work for its own growing population of amputee veterans, the infrastructure was there: orthopedic surgeons, limb workshops, technicians, and therapists. The war itself had prompted investment in better artificial limbs, more functional and more comfortable than many interwar designs. When German amputees entered this system as POWs, they carried their status as enemy soldiers with them. Yet once classified as patients in an orthopedic ward, they also entered the orbit of American medical practice, which was leaning toward restoration rather than simple survival. In Europe, near the front, the setup was rougher. Prisoner wards improvised in former barracks or schools might only stabilize the wounded and prepare them for evacuation. But further back, in general hospitals and specialized facilities, the routines of a modern medical institution pressed down on the question of what to do with a man who had lost a leg below the knee, an arm at the shoulder, or both legs to a landmine. Some would eventually be repatriated early on medical grounds. Others, especially younger, otherwise healthy amputees, would stay in captivity for years, working within the bounds of their disability. For both groups, a prosthetic limb could mean the difference between being a permanent invalid and regaining enough function to work, to walk, to manage basic tasks without constant assistance. So American doctors measured. They examined stumps, ordered X-rays, revised surgeries when needed to prepare a better base for an artificial limb. They sent requisitions to limb shops or brought mobile teams of prosthetists into POW hospitals. They scheduled physiotherapy sessions, taught balance and gait, trained fingers and hooks to grip. None of this erased the fact that the men on the beds had worn the uniform of the enemy. Many American staff had lost friends or family in combat against the very army now lying before them. Yet in ward after ward, a colder, more structured set of obligations overrode private rage. This was how, in a war of annihilation, an American major with a stethoscope could find himself arguing over socket fits and joint alignment for a captured NCO who, months earlier, had fought under the black and white flag of the Reich. From the perspective of policy, this all flowed from signatures on an international treaty, from field manuals, from orders signed at desks far behind the lines. From the perspective of the German soldier on the bed, everything narrowed to a much simpler truth. The men standing at his bedside held his future quite literally in their hands, whether he would be left to drag himself through the rest of his life or stand again on a leg built by the enemy. Fear traveled faster than any ambulance. Among German troops, stories about what happened to captives multiplied with each retreat. Men coming from the Eastern Front spoke in low voices about columns marched to death, about camps where hunger and cold killed almost as surely as bullets. Others repeated what propaganda had hammered home for years, that the Anglo-Americans were hypocrites, talking about humanity while burning cities from the air, and that German soldiers, especially SS or paratroopers, could expect no mercy if they fell into enemy hands. For the lightly wounded, the fear was blunt but distant. They imagined hard labor, poor rations, years behind barbed wire. For the badly disabled, it cut deeper. A man without legs or with both arms gone could visualize nothing but dependence. In a country not his own, among enemies who owed him nothing, what use could he possibly be? As the Reich collapsed, rumors hardened into dark certainties. They will shoot cripples, they won't feed the useless. A phrase like that spoken in a barn or a trench could linger in a man's mind for months. By the time he lay staring at the ceiling of an American run ward, listening to boots in the corridor, the picture was complete. A sorting, then trucks, then the edge of a field somewhere behind the camp. Many disabled German prisoners later wrote that no one had to tell them to expect the worst. They assumed it. They knew what their own state had done to those judged unfit. They had seen hospitals emptied, neighbors vanish, whispers about mercy deaths. It was not a stretch to imagine that their conquerors might arrive at similar conclusions. The silence made it worse. Guards rarely explained the full routine of a hospital to the men on the beds. Orders came in brief commands. Get up. Come with us. A list of names read out in accented German could sound like a death sentence. Under those conditions, the arrival of doctors with measuring tapes and plaster of Paris did not immediately cancel the dread. It took time for the reality to sink in that the enemy's plans for them involved not a ditch, but a workshop. On the other side of the white curtain, another kind of struggle played out in quieter tones. American medical officers had taken oaths and absorbed a professional culture that, by the 1940s, placed a strong emphasis on impartial care. Training films and manuals for the U.S. Army Medical Department reminded surgeons and medics that enemy wounded were to be treated according to the same medical standards as their own men, subject only to the hard arithmetic of triage in battle. Yet many of those doctors and nurses were also citizens in a country at war. They read casualty lists from Normandy and the Ardennes. They saw telegrams delivered to their own neighborhoods. Some had lost brothers, sons, or classmates in the very battles that produced the German prisoners now occupying their hospital beds. Accounts from wartime hospitals describe scenes in which a German POW lay anesthetized on an operating table, while across the corridor an American soldier with a similar wound fought for his life. Surgeons moved between them, hands still damp from washing, thinking not about flags but about circulation, infection, and blood loss. Officially, they were expected to bracket out personal feelings. Once the gown was on and the mask was tied, the human body beneath the surgical light was reduced to anatomy and vital signs. But between procedures, in the quiet minutes of charting and smoking and exhaustion, those same staff had to process what they were doing, using their skill and their country's resources to save and then to rehabilitate men who had fought for a regime responsible for massive destruction and atrocity. For some, the Geneva Convention and professional ethics provided solid footing. The idea that their own captured comrades might benefit from reciprocal treatment gave a pragmatic edge to moral duty. Others admitted a more basic motivation, that turning away from a bleeding man on purpose would mark a line they were not willing to cross, even in war. Nowhere did this tension show more clearly than in the decision to do more than merely keep an enemy alive, to invest time and effort in making him whole, or as close to whole as medicine allowed. The tools to do so had been shaped by earlier wars. By the 1940s, artificial limbs were entering a new phase. The crude peg legs and heavy, rigid arms of the 19th century had given way, after the slaughter of 1914-1918, to more articulated, more anatomically informed designs. World War I had produced hundreds of thousands of amputees across Europe and North America. Governments and private companies had poured money and ingenuity into finding ways for men with missing limbs to return to work, to reduce pension burdens, and to blunt the visible cost of war. Between the wars, American companies refined knee and ankle joints, experimented with lighter alloys, and improved socket designs to distribute pressure more evenly on the stump. Surgeons and engineers worked together in a small but growing specialty of orthopedic and prosthetic medicine. When World War II began, this work accelerated again. The U.S. government funded research into more functional upper limb prostheses, better suspension systems, and standardized modular components that could be manufactured in volume. The result, by the middle of the 1940s, was a suite of technologies that, though primitive by modern standards, represented a significant step forward. Below-knee amputees could be fitted with limbs that allowed a relatively natural gait after training. Above-knee amputees faced more challenges, but innovations in knee joints and harnessing promised greater stability. For those who had lost arms, hook devices controlled by shoulder movements could restore the ability to grasp, lift, and manipulate objects. Limb-fitting centers in the United States became hubs of this work, staffed by orthopedic surgeons, prosthetists, and physiotherapists. Their primary clientele were American servicemen, but the techniques they perfected, shaping stumps surgically to accept a prosthesis, casting them in plaster, carving and machining sockets, adjusting alignment, could be applied to any human body, regardless of the uniform it once wore. When disabled German POWs entered this world, often through the side door of a POW hospital ward or a separate annex, they encountered machines and methods far more advanced than many had seen at home. Measuring calipers, adjustable metal uprights, articulated feet, and standardized hooks assembled from racks of labeled parts. Therapy rooms with parallel bars where men in hospital pajamas took their first unsteady artificial steps. For them, these devices were not just technology, they were a verdict. Someone had decided they were worth the labor it took to craft and fit this apparatus. Someone had concluded that the appropriate response to a missing limb, even on a defeated enemy, was to build a new one. In those wards, fear, duty, and technology met in the same cramped space. The terrified prisoner expecting a bullet, the American doctor guided by law and conscience, and the silent geometry of rods and straps that could restore movement. In the regulations, the language was dry. Prisoners of war, it said, could be required to work if they were fit. The tasks must not be dangerous, humiliating, or directly connected to military operations. They were to be paid a modest wage, housed decently, and their health preserved. Officers were exempt from manual labor, but enlisted men and NCOs could be sent to fields, forests, and factories, so long as the work met the rules spelled out in Geneva. In practice, that meant German POWs in American hands harvested cotton in the South, picked fruit in California, felled trees, repaired roads, loaded freight, and did 1,000 other jobs that freed American civilians for higher priority war industries. By 1944, this labor force had become an invisible but important part of the wartime economy. Within that framework, a disabled prisoner was not just a humanitarian concern, he was also a lost worker. A man missing a leg could, with the right prosthesis, manage light duties, kitchen work, clerical tasks, camp maintenance. An arm amputee fitted with a functional hook might still sort mail, assemble crates, or help in workshops. For camp commandants pressed to meet labor quotas, and for agricultural contractors watching crops ripen faster than they could find hands to pick them, the question of whether a disabled POW could be made partially productive was not abstract. So the motives tangled. When American doctors and administrators arranged for prosthetic limbs to be made for some German POWs, they were acting within a web of legal obligations, medical ethics, and economic calculations. A soldier who could walk with an artificial leg required fewer attendants. One who could handle tools with a prosthetic arm might one day work in a POW labor detachment instead of remaining a permanent patient. This does not erase the real compassion many medical staff felt, nor the moral weight of restoring function to maimed bodies, but it adds another layer to the story. In the prisoner economy of the 1940s, rehabilitation could be both kindness and utility. A new limb could be a gift and an investment. To the man strapping it on for the first time, the distinction mattered less than the fact that, with training and effort, he might again be able to walk to the mess hall under his own power. Behind that practical logic lay a deeper, starker contrast. Inside Germany, before and during the early years of the war, people with severe mental and physical disabilities, children and adults, had been taken from hospitals and care homes in buses with painted-over windows. They were sent to special centers where doctors and nurses, following secret orders, killed them with gas injections or deliberate neglect. The program, known later as Action T4, was justified in the language of mercy and racial hygiene. In reality, it reflected a brutal calculus. The state would not support those it judged unproductive or degenerate. Public protests and unease eventually forced the official suspension of the centralized program in 1941, but killings continued in decentralized forms. Within this system, the category of worthy disabled person was narrow. War veterans who had lost limbs often occupied a special place in propaganda as symbols of sacrifice, but the ideology that condemned weakness never disappeared. Many front soldiers did not know the full extent of the killings, but rumors circulated. Hospital staff talked. Relatives spoke cautiously of patients who went into institutions and never returned. The sense that the regime viewed certain lives as expendable seeped into the background of daily existence. Now, some of the same men who had fought for that regime lay as prisoners under fluorescent lights and ceiling fans, in wards flying the American flag. They had been taught to see themselves as part of a chosen community, superior to the decadent democracies. Yet here, in enemy custody, they were offered something their own state had often denied to its weakest citizens: careful, resource-intensive efforts not just to keep them alive, but to reintegrate them as functioning human beings. For those who grasped this contrast, it could be disorienting. An American doctor who adjusted the angle of a German POW's artificial knee joint was, in a quiet way, refuting the logic of Nazi euthanasia. He was saying, through his work, that a man missing a leg was still a bearer of rights, still entitled to dignity, even if he had worn the enemy's uniform. Years later, in post-war interviews and writings, some former POWs recalled this as a turning point in their understanding of what the war had been about. Not grand speeches, not leaflets, but the felt difference between a state that disposed of its disabled in secret and an enemy that labored to help a captured soldier stand again. The consequences of these choices extended far beyond the wire. When the war ended and their captivity eventually came to a close, thousands of German veterans returned to a homeland in ruins. Cities were flattened, factories silent, families scattered or gone. Food was scarce. Housing was improvised from cellars and half-standing walls. In this landscape, a missing limb could mean absolute dependence unless it was paired with a functioning prosthesis. Men who had learned to walk with American-made artificial legs, or to use hooks to grip and turn, found that those skills translated directly into survival and participation in the slow rebuilding of their towns and villages. A farmer with a prosthetic leg might still manage a small holding. A craftsman missing a hand but trained on a mechanical hook could sort, carry, and repair. Even the act of being able to walk to a ration queue without assistance changed family dynamics. Many of these devices bore no obvious national stamp. Metal uprights and wooden feet did not declare their origin. But the memory of where they were first fitted, of which country's doctors had supervised the training sessions along the parallel bars, stayed vivid. In West Germany's early post-war years, the presence of former POWs who had spent time in American camps, and in some cases American hospitals, became one among many threads shaping attitudes toward the United States. They carried stories of humane treatment, of adequate food, of medical care that did not stop at strict necessity. Among them were men who moved through the streets on limbs designed, cast, and calibrated far from their hometowns. Their prostheses were not political statements, they were tools. Yet each one also embodied a decision made in wartime, that an enemy's shattered body would be rebuilt rather than discarded. For the individuals fitted with these limbs, the impact lasted a lifetime. Every step on an artificial foot, every object grasped by a metal hook, tied the present moment to that earlier scene in a POW ward when, expecting the worst, they had watched an American clinician bend over their stump with a tape measure. Those limbs aged with them. Sockets wore down, straps frayed. Some were replaced or modified by German technicians as the decades went on. Others remained patched and adjusted for 20 or 30 years. In photographs of family gatherings and factory floors, in wedding pictures and street scenes from the 1950s and 60s, they appear only as a slight irregularity in stance, a visible harness under a shirt, a certain way of turning the body. Yet behind that small asymmetry lies the larger, quieter story. In the midst of a total war, the conquerors did something more demanding than destruction. They spent time, material, and human attention to ensure that men who had fought against them could, if they survived captivity, do more than crawl. From this dense tangle of fear, ethics, technology, and long-term consequence emerges the moment of sharpest tension, the point when the disabled prisoners, braced for execution, first realized that the enemy's hands were building, not killing. Continue to Section 1 of Climax. The war's last winter pressed itself against the glass. Outside, in the yards of hastily repurposed German barracks on the western bank of the Rhine, snow lay in gray ridges where boots and stretchers had trampled it. American trucks idled in thin exhaust, their canvas covers flecked with ice. Watchtowers, now manned by men in olive drab instead of field gray, surveyed long lines of wire and low wooden huts. Inside one of the main buildings, a former training hall converted in a hurry, the air was thick and warm. Rows of iron beds stretched to a far wall where a faded mural of pre-war drills still showed young German recruits running in formation. Now the only movement came in slower, halting rhythms. On the beds lay the survivors of the Ardennes and the retreat through the Eifel. Their uniforms had been cut away days or weeks earlier. Some still wore scavenged German greatcoats over American hospital pajamas. Stumps rested on pillows at the ends of blankets. Bandages showed that yellow-brown seepage between fresh and infected. The smell of carbolic and boiled linen fought to cover the deeper odors of sweat, human waste, and fear. Each man carried his own map of the winter campaign on his body. A leg gone above the knee from a mine outside Bostonia. Both feet lost to frostbite on the march back from a failed counterattack. An arm taken off where an artillery shell had burst through a pine forest. Names and dates were scribbled on their admission tags. Captured near Hufeleis, evacuated from a crossroads south of St. Vith, found in a barn outside Malmedy. The front had rolled past them. American armored columns now drove east toward the Rhine crossings. For the men in these beds, the war was no longer a series of positions on a map. It was reduced to the space between mattress and ceiling, to the daily rhythm of dressings changed, bowls of thin soup, and the clatter of boots in the corridor. It was in that closed world that the rumors took on shape. Some came from orderlies, other German POWs assigned to clean, to empty bedpans, to push wheelchairs down the corridor. They had heard talk in the camp compound, beyond the walls of the hospital, about labor detachments sent to farms and factories, about selection, who was fit, who was not. Words like useless mouths and burden floated back into the ward, carrying echoes of a different system in a different country, but attached now to the same category of human being. Others simply joined the dots they knew too well. They had seen their own state deem certain lives unworthy of continued support. They had watched the way food, medicine, and fuel were withdrawn first from the weak when shortages bit. They had heard of shootings of wounded Soviet prisoners earlier in the war, of starving columns walked to exhaustion. They knew what a radicalized state could decide in extremity. Why should the Americans, who had every reason to hate them, be more generous? So when, one morning near the end of February 1945, the ward door opened and two American officers entered with clipboards and a German-speaking interpreter, the sudden hush was almost physical. They walked slowly between the rows of beds, stopping at each one. They asked names, units, dates of wounding. They pulled back blankets to look at stumps. One of the doctors, a major with deep lines etched from months of field surgery, palpated along scar tissue with practiced fingers, checking for infection, feeling the shape where bone met muscle. At a few beds, he frowned slightly, marking the chart with a notation and murmuring to the captain following him. At others, he nodded, wrote something else, and moved on. To the men watching, this felt uncomfortably close to a sorting. Those whose bandages were still blood bright assumed one category for themselves, too recently wounded to move. Those whose stumps had healed into puckered scars, who could sit up unaided, whose pain had retreated into a constant dull ache, felt themselves marked mentally with another. Which group was more at risk, no one knew. Later that day, a list of names was read out. 30-odd men from the ward were told they were to be transferred in the morning. No explanation, no detail about where. For hours after the lights went out, the whispers went bed to bed in fragments. Some argued almost angrily that the Americans needed labor, not corpses, that it made no sense to waste food and medicine for weeks only to execute men who could at least sweep floors or peel potatoes. Others countered with the reality that no one so far had seen a disabled prisoner leave the hospital and return with any tale of what lay beyond. At dawn, the pattern of the hospital asserted itself again. Breakfast trays rattled, water basins were carried in, dressings were changed. Then, just before midday, the selected men were moved. Not to a yard. They were wheeled instead down a different corridor, past a set of double doors marked in English and Red Cross symbols, into a wing they had not seen before. Here the beds were spaced farther apart. In one room, parallel bars ran down the center, the kind used in physical therapy rooms. In another, racks and benches held strange assemblages of metal rods, leather straps, and wooden blocks shaped roughly like feet. This was the orthopedic section. In the weeks before, as the scale of amputations among both American and German casualties mounted, the Army had flown in an orthopedic surgery team from a rear general hospital. Their job was to revise badly performed field amputations, prevent chronic infection, and where possible prepare limbs for prosthetic fitting. Alongside them came a small detachment of prosthetic technicians, trained in limb fitting centers back in the United States. They had no separate doctrine for prisoners. Their expertise, once deployed forward, applied to every human stump that could benefit from their work. For the German POWs rolled into that wing, the transformation was jarring. Where the main ward had been crowded and dim, with the sour smell of too many bodies in too small a space, this area was brightly lit. Instruments hung in neat rows. On a workbench by a sunlit window, a technician planed a piece of hardwood that would become the core of a prosthetic shank. Nearby, plaster bandages and buckets stood ready, alongside metal uprights and simple joints wrapped in oiled paper. One by one, the men were examined again, this time with a different eye. The major traced the lines of old surgical scars, measuring distance from knee to stump end. He checked range of motion in joints that remained, noting muscle strength. For above-knee amputees, he assessed pelvis stability. For those missing arms, he tested shoulder movement and residual limb sensitivity. Through the interpreter, explanations began to filter into minds primed only for dread. These assessments, they were told, would determine what kind of artificial limb could be fitted. Some stumps would need minor surgery to reshape bone ends or remove damaged tissue before a prosthesis would sit comfortably. Others were already good candidates. Plaster casts would be taken. The casts would go to the workshop where sockets would be formed. Then there would be fittings, adjustments, and eventually training in how to use the new limb. The words did not erase months of fear in an instant. For many, the concept itself felt almost unreal. To go from expecting a bullet to hearing about training and fitting was too abrupt a shift to accept without suspicion. Still, the actions unfolding around them had a concrete, undeniable logic. When the technicians approached with buckets of lukewarm water and rolls of plaster, when they gently wrapped wet bandages around stumps, smoothing the material so it captured every contour, when they marked alignment lines and socket reference points as the plaster set, something in the room's temperature changed. These were not the gestures of men preparing a body for disposal. They were the careful, time-consuming steps of a craft dedicated to making broken bodies useful again. By evening, casts rested in rows along a shelf, each labeled with a prisoner's number. The technicians began the slow work of filling them, carving sockets, attaching uprights, adjusting approximate lengths. On the ward, the selected men lay staring at the ceiling, their minds adjusting as slowly as the plaster had hardened. They still did not know what awaited them after the fitting was complete. They could not yet picture themselves walking, however awkwardly, with wooden feet and metal knees along the corridors where they now lay. But for the first time since capture, the line between life and mere existence seemed to bend. In the weeks that followed, time in the orthopedic wing took on its own strange rhythm. The war outside lurched toward its end, bridges over the Rhine seized, cities encircled, columns of prisoners stretching down German roads, but inside these few whitewashed rooms the days were measured in smaller increments, in the setting of plaster, in the ache of a stump coaxed into new angles, in the first tentative shift of weight onto something other than bare bone and scar. Some of the selected men went first to surgery. Field amputations, done under battlefield conditions with minimal time and supplies, often left rough edges of bone and poorly balanced muscle. The orthopedic team revised what they could. They shortened tibias by a few centimeters, smoothed femoral ends, freed trapped nerves that had formed painful neuromas. Each operation meant going under anesthetic again, waking to fresh bandages and a sharper, more focused pain. But it also meant a better chance that a prosthetic socket would one day sit without rubbing raw flesh. Others were ready for fitting as they were. For them, the next stage began when an orderly arrived with an attendant, a pair of crutches and quiet instructions to try sitting, then standing. The first encounter with an unfinished limb was almost always a shock. Instead of a foot, there might be a crude wooden block. Instead of a sleek, finished surface, raw leather and metal glinted under temporary bandages and straps. The device was not yet theirs. It was an approximation built to see if the measurements were right, if the alignment would allow them to balance without pitching to one side. Fitting sessions were held in a room dominated by the parallel bars. At one end, a row of chairs stood ready. Patients were lifted or helped into them, one by one. Technicians knelt to strap on the trial limbs, tightening buckles around thighs and hips, checking for circulation, asking through the interpreter whether the pressure was bearable. When the time came to stand, the room always fell a little quieter. A man who had not felt his body fully upright since the blast that took his leg now pushed against the bars, arms trembling. The new limb met the floor with an uncertain thud, muscles in his back and remaining leg clenched hard, overcompensating. For a moment, the whole structure of bone, wood, and will was precarious. Some managed a few seconds, then had to sit again, sweat beading on their foreheads from the effort. Others, driven by stubborn pride or a fear of being judged hopeless, clung to the bars until they could shuffle a step, then another, learning in real time what the technicians had tried to explain, that walking with an artificial limb was a new skill, not a simple restoration of the old. Falls were common. Knees buckled, balance betrayed them, crutches slipped. Each time, orderlies and therapists were there to haul them upright, to check for reopened wounds, to decide whether to stop or press on. There was frustration, anger turned inward, moments when a man staring at the apparatus strapped to him felt more like an object being experimented on than a person being helped. Yet repetition wore new pathways. By the time winter's grip loosened outside and the first muddy thaw appeared in the camp yard, some of the amputees could move the length of the bars without assistance. A few progressed to crutches alone, taking slow circuits of the ward. Their gait was uneven, their movements cautious, but they moved under their own power. Around them the wider war shifted. In March, American forces crossed the Rhine in force. In April, they fanned out through central and southern Germany, linking up with Soviet troops along the Elbe. On 8 May 1945, the guns fell silent in Europe. For the German prisoners, the reality lagged behind the date. They heard the news secondhand through guards' comments, scraps of newspaper, the changed tone of announcements. The state in whose name they had fought no longer existed. They remained behind wire. From that point on, the legal and administrative landscape grew more complicated. New mass surrenders were processed under categories: disarmed enemy forces, interned persons, that skirted the clear protections of the Geneva Convention. Holding powers argued over how many prisoners each would take, for how long, and under what terms. But for those already formally registered as prisoners of war in American hands, especially those in hospitals and special medical facilities, the established routines of care continued. Some orthopedic teams were rotated back to rear areas or to the United States, their places taken by others. Prosthetic workshops were expanded in certain larger POW hospitals. In occupied Germany in the American zone, former Wehrmacht hospitals were reclassified and staffed in part by U.S. personnel, in part by German doctors working under Allied supervision. There, too, fitting and rehabilitation of amputees proceeded, now in a country that had changed flags but not geography. For the disabled prisoners, the end of fighting introduced a new series of questions. If the war was over, when would they be sent home? Would the Americans still invest effort in crafting artificial limbs for men they no longer needed to fight or to encourage surrender? Or would priorities shift, leaving them in a half-finished state, stumps healed but mobility never fully restored? Policy moved in parallel with these private anxieties. American authorities, under the rules they had long cited, were now obligated not only to maintain the health of prisoners, but to consider repatriation of those who were seriously disabled or chronically ill. Inspections by the International Committee of the Red Cross continued. Lists were drawn up of men deemed unfit for further captivity, whose medical condition justified an early return. For some amputees, especially those who had lost multiple limbs or suffered additional internal injuries, this meant a relatively quick journey back to Germany, sometimes within months of the war's end. They left camps and hospitals still on crutches or confined to wheelchairs, their limbs not yet fitted or fully trained, trusting that whatever awaited them at home could offer better long-term support than an American-run ward. For others, particularly those who were young, otherwise healthy, and missing only a single limb, the path was different. Camp administrators and medical officers saw in them a potential to become partially self-sufficient within the confines of captivity. Once they mastered their prostheses, they could, in theory, work in kitchens, workshops, and administrative offices, reducing the burden on both American staff and fellow prisoners. Repatriation for them was postponed, sometimes for years, as they formed part of the labor pool the United States and later its European allies used to rebuild damaged infrastructure and support their own economies. This mixture of motives did not change the physical reality in the therapy rooms. Every day, men practiced rising from chairs without pulling on the bars. They learned how to descend a short flight of steps with an artificial leg leading or following in the safest sequence. Those missing arms adapted to the rhythm of hooks that opened and closed with shoulder movements, first clumsily, then with increasing precision. Tasks that had seemed unreachable, buttoning a shirt, lifting a pot, writing a legible line, returned modified but recognizable. As the months wore on, the atmosphere in the wards shifted from suspended dread to a strange, disciplined anticipation. Men talked less about execution and more about dates, rumored transports, possible exchanges, the distant prospect of home. They speculated about how their new limbs would fare on cobblestone streets, in farmyards, on factory floors that no longer existed as they remembered them. The The presence of these prosthetic devices, still smelling of fresh leather and oil, forced them to imagine futures they had not allowed themselves to consider when they lay expecting a bullet in the corridor. For the American staff, the work became part of a broader, quieter campaign that outlasted the shooting war, the stabilization of a defeated enemy population. In one sense, they were simply continuing the procedures they had followed from the beginning, under orders and under the watchful eye of international law. In another, more subtle sense, they were contributing to something with a longer horizon. Every prisoner who left their care able to walk with a stick instead of being carried, to feed himself instead of relying on a family already strained by privation, would shape the social and economic landscape of post-war Germany in small but cumulative ways. By the time the first major waves of repatriation began in earnest, the orthopedic wings of American-run hospitals had seen hundreds of such cases pass through. Some left on unfinished limbs to be refitted at home. Others walked to the outbound trains on devices entirely made and adjusted within those walls. The turning point that had begun in a single winter ward men braced for execution, met instead by plaster and tape measures, had by then repeated itself in countless other rooms and camps, each following the same pattern of fear, surprise, resistance, and slow adaptation. What remained was to see what those choices would mean once the wire and guard towers were behind them. When the first trains rolled out, they did not look like the triumphant homecomings of newsreels. They were ordinary freight or passenger cars swept out quickly, benches repaired just enough to hold another load of men. On their sides, chalk markings and paperwork identified them as repatriation transports. Inside, the air smelled of wool, tobacco, and apprehension. By mid-1945, the scale of German captivity in Allied hands was vast. Millions of soldiers had laid down their weapons on the Western Front alone. Around a third of them at various points fell under American control, first in Europe, then in camps across the Atlantic. Among that mass of faces were the visibly altered, men whose sleeves ended at the elbow with nothing beyond, whose trouser legs were pinned and empty, whose gait on the platform was irregular and cautious as they waited to board. American records, Red Cross reports, and later studies all converged on one fact. German prisoners in U.S. hands, even in the chaos of the war's final months, experienced far lower mortality than on most other fronts. Disease and malnutrition were not eliminated, but they did not cut through the camps as they did elsewhere. Medical care, though sometimes strained by numbers, existed as an organized system, with resources and staff behind it. Within that system, the disabled and chronically ill formed a distinct category. Under the rules the United States had cited from the beginning, prisoners whose health was gravely compromised, advanced tuberculosis, severe heart disease, multiple amputations, blindness were candidates for early repatriation. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates moving from camp to camp reviewed medical lists, inspected hospital wards, and pressed for the return of those least able to endure long captivity. The process was slow, uneven, and shaped by politics as much as by medicine. Yet by late 1945 and 1946, streams of disabled POWs were making their way back into what had once been the Reich. In the camps, the waiting had its own texture. For men who were not yet on a repatriation list, life settled into a rigid, predictable pattern. Morning roll call, breakfast, work details for those who could manage them, medical checks, and the nightly ritual of counting heads behind the wire. The newly limbed moved through this routine alongside the uninjured, though with different tasks. A man with an artificial leg might work in the camp kitchens, washing pots or serving food. One with a prosthetic arm could be assigned to clerical work, sorting papers, or basic maintenance around the hospital itself. Those too disabled to work remained in wards and convalescent barracks, their days marked by minor adjustments to sockets, by the slow evolution of scars from angry red to pale and waxy. Some used their enforced idleness to learn basic English from sympathetic guards or chaplains. Others turned inward, writing letters that would take weeks to move through censors and postal delays, trying to bridge the gap between their current limbo and relatives they had not seen in years. There was bureaucracy in every step. American camp commandants compiled rosters, noting each man's health status, wounds, and any prosthetic devices issued. Medical officers filled out forms describing the level of function achieved, able to walk with cane, uses crutches, independent in self-care. These documents accompanied the men on their journey, part of the paper trail that would inform whatever awaited them in German hospitals or welfare offices. International observers left their own written traces. Red Cross reports, couched in careful diplomatic language, described conditions in POW hospitals, the availability of surgical care, the presence of special wards for amputees, the existence of workshops where artificial limbs were constructed and fitted. They noted both adequacies and shortcomings, instances where overcrowding strained facilities, or where shortages of materials delayed the fitting of prostheses. From these fragments, a picture emerges of a system that, however imperfect, did not treat disabled enemy prisoners as disposable. In late autumn of 1945, at a railhead in France, a group of such men waited under a low, damp sky. Some were on stretchers carried by fellow prisoners up the ramp into the train. Most, though walked, they moved slowly. With the deliberate care of those still learning the limits of their altered bodies, artificial feet tested the slick wooden steps, metal hooks gripped doorframes. Once inside, they found places along the benches, leaning their canes or crutches against the wall, adjusting the fit of straps that chafed under their uniforms. As the train jolted into motion, the motion itself became a new test. Muscles worked to keep balance as wheels clattered over joints in the track. The landscape outside, flattened towns, broken bridges, fields pocked with craters, slid past in a blur, while inside, men reached down occasionally to touch the foreign material that now bore their weight. They were leaving behind the regular meals, the structured care, and the relative stability of American-run camps. Ahead lay a country in which food and fuel were scarce, housing was improvised, and medical systems were themselves struggling to reconstitute basic services. Whatever advantage they carried, American-fitted limbs, some training in their use, would be tested against rubble shortages and the dislocation of families who might or might not still be where they were last known to live. For the American staff who had watched them board, the scene was mixed with its own contradictions. They had invested hours, days, sometimes months in surgeries, fittings, and therapy sessions with these men. Now they were sending them back into a defeated nation whose armies not long before had been the enemy. The formal duty ended at the edge of the platform. Yet the knowledge that each departing figure, limping or steady, would carry their work into a landscape they themselves would never see added a muted weight to the farewell. Those trains did not carry statistics. They carried individuals. But collectively, they marked the first wave of a broader transition, from controlled, rule-bound captivity under an external power to the uncertain realities of life in a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left. As the wheels carried them eastward, the question shifted from how the Americans had chosen to treat them, to how the society receiving them would manage the human consequences of a lost war, consequences made visible with every artificial foot that tapped against the wooden floor of a returning carriage. They came back to a country that no longer matched the map in their heads. Stations where they had once changed trains on leave were now hollowed shells. Glassless windows gaped over platforms where refugees, demobilized soldiers, and families with bundles crowded the edge of the tracks. The signs still bore familiar German names, but beyond them streets ended in piles of brick. Church spires stood over empty lots. Whole neighborhoods had become gaps. For the disabled returnees, the first steps onto German soil were literal tests. Artificial feet adjusted to broken pavements and missing cobblestones. Makeshift ramps or shoulders under the arm replaced the level floors of American hospitals. Crutches skidded on rubble dust. Those with prosthetic arms discovered that carrying even a small suitcase over uneven ground demanded more strength and coordination than any therapy session had simulated. Their first stop was often another hospital. In what was now divided Germany, medical facilities were unevenly distributed and unevenly supplied. In the western zones, the American, British, and French local doctors and newly reconstituted health authorities tried to build on whatever foundations remained. They received men with healed stumps, with American-style sockets and joints, with medical papers describing operations performed thousands of kilometers away. Some prostheses could be adjusted, repaired, or copied. Others required improvisation when parts wore out and official supply channels were years from normal. German limb makers, many of whom had honed their craft after the previous war, studied the foreign designs with professional interest. They adapted features, substituted materials, and incorporated what they could into their own evolving practice. The state that emerged in the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, soon faced the reality that hundreds of thousands of its male citizens were living with significant war-related disabilities. Not only former prisoners, but men who had been treated within collapsing Wehrmacht systems, civilians injured in bombings, and those maimed in the last chaotic battles of 1945. Under pressure from veterans' organizations, churches, and political parties courting their votes, West German lawmakers crafted legislation to support them. Compensation laws and pension schemes refined in the 1950s formalized entitlements to medical care, prosthetics, and financial support. Orthopedic workshops multiplied. University clinics expanded departments dedicated to physical rehabilitation. In that environment, the American fitted limbs some men had brought back were not static relics, they were starting points. Sockets were relined with new materials as stump shapes changed over time. Joints were upgraded when domestic designs improved. Straps, worn thin, were replaced. In some cases, the original artificial limb was retired entirely, replaced by a German-made version that nonetheless owed part of its design lineage to American wartime research. For the wearers, the continuity was simpler. Whether the device under their trouser leg had been carved in a U.S. Army workshop in 1945 or in a Bremen factory in 1958, it remained the physical bridge between dependence and autonomy. It allowed them to walk to work in the growing factories of the Wirtschaftswunder, to stand at machine tools, to pedal adapted bicycles to suburban homes that rose where ruins had once stood. Memory followed a different path. In veterans' circles, church basements, and family living rooms, former POWs spoke about their captivity. Experiences differed sharply depending on where they had been held. Men who had spent years in Soviet labor camps told one set of stories, those who had been in French or British custody another. For the ones who had passed through American hospitals and orthopedic wards, certain images recurred. The abundance of food compared to the hunger at home, the impersonal efficiency of the camp routines, the unexpected thoroughness of medical care. They recalled American doctors arguing with guards over the need for more bandage supplies. They remembered chaplains or Red Cross workers checking on them not as prisoners, but as patients. And they remembered, with a detail that remained sharp decades later, the moment when plaster had been wrapped around a stump they had assumed would doom them to a chair forever. These accounts flowed into a broader reorientation. As West Germany aligned itself politically and militarily with the United States in the emerging Cold War, the image of the former enemy shifted. Official narratives emphasized the Marshall Plan, airlifts, and alliance. Beneath that layer, in the texture of everyday attitudes, lay quieter, more personal impressions, like those of men who could cross a factory floor because of techniques and sometimes devices first given to them in an American-run ward. The war's legacy did not end at national borders. Internationally, the treatment of prisoners during World War II, good and bad alike, fed directly into the rewriting and expansion of the Geneva Conventions in 1949. The new agreements strengthened protections for POWs, clarified obligations for medical care, and extended detailed rules to civilians in occupied territories. The principle that enemy wounded and sick were to be collected and cared for impartially without adverse distinction was stated more firmly and more fully than before. Embedded in that legal language was the lesson of countless individual choices. When a U.S. Army surgeon in 1945 extended the same level of care to a disabled German prisoner as to an American amputee, he was not only following existing law, he was also contributing to the emerging expectation that such conduct was the standard, not an exception. When prosthetic technicians spent months building and refining limbs for men who would leave their custody as soon as peace allowed, they gave substance to the notion that duties toward the enemy extended beyond the bare minimum of keeping him alive. Modern military medical codes, and the training of medics and doctors in many countries, carry that tradition forward. In conflicts since, photographs and reports have shown enemy fighters and civilians lying on adjacent beds in field hospitals, receiving treatment from the same teams. The sight is no less jarring now than it was in 1945. The same questions echo: why invest scarce resources in those who were trying to kill you yesterday? Part of the answer lies in the history behind it, in the knowledge that choices made in war's hardest moments set precedents that will govern the next. In post-war Europe, the men who moved through life on limbs first fitted by their captors embodied one of those precedents. Every step they took, every task performed with an artificial hand, was a quiet, continuing consequence of decisions made when the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, but the shape of its aftermath was still uncertain. Their story leads naturally to a wider reflection on what that choice meant, not just for them, but for the way we understand victory, defeat, and responsibility. In that winter ward in 1945, the question had been brutally simple. Would these men, stripped of power, stripped of limbs, be allowed to exist? The answer came not in speeches but in the quiet, methodical work of hands: plaster wrapped around raw stumps, bone ends reshaped, metal joints aligned, hours spent in cramped rooms teaching former enemies to stand, to balance, to fall safely and try again. In a war that had seen cities incinerated and entire populations marked for destruction, such scenes did not alter the outcome at the front. Germany still fell. The camps were still opened. The dead stayed dead. Nothing about a prosthetic limb could redeem what had been done. Yet within that immensity, the choice to rebuild broken enemy bodies drew a line. On one side stood the logic that had led to Action T4, to selections on ramps, to the idea that certain lives could be weighed, found wanting and erased for the supposed good of the whole. On the other stood a different insistence, that even a defeated, maimed soldier from the wrong army retained a claim on care, on effort, on the skilled attention of strangers. International law gave that claim words, professional codes gave it form, but in the end it was enacted in the most concrete of ways, in the production of thousands of artificial legs and arms for men who could never fight again. Decades later, an aging veteran crosses a quiet street in a rebuilt German town. His gait is uneven but steady. Under his trouser leg, leather creaks softly. The limb he places on the pavement is no longer the same device first strapped to him in an American hospital. Parts have been replaced, materials have changed, but the line of descent is unbroken. His continued movement traces back to a decision made in a moment when it would have been easier, cheaper, and more satisfying to do nothing. Wars are often measured in territory gained, in capitals taken, in the number of enemy dead. This story suggests another measure, in the number of enemies who walked away literally because the victors chose restraint over revenge, obligation over indifference. In the end, the new limbs fitted in those wards were more than metal and wood. They were a statement about what it means to win.